Yes, today we get to talk about another book in the New Testament, and that book is 1 Corinthians. I'm Pastor Steve and I get to do just a little bit of an overview right now of the book. Now, the 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 1 says, Paul, an apostle called by Jesus, and our brother Surveillance. Now, we know Paul's very famous in the Bible, and it's clear that he is the writer of 1 Corinthians. Surveillance is somebody who we don't know much about, but he's listed as one of the contributors or writers to the book. We do know that there is a Surveillance mentioned in Acts 18 who went against Paul and tried to have Paul beaten up by the Roman authority at the time, and it all backfired, and in fact the crowd beat Surveillance up instead. So if this is indeed the same person, and bearing in mind that Acts 18 covers Paul's missionary journey to Corinth, then you see a miraculous conversion, a turned around in his faith like so many other people at that time, and here he was joining Paul on his journey and writing to the church at Corinth. Now, Corinth is really interesting. It's a really interesting place geographically. If you think about the country of Greece, you've got this really big section at the bottom and a small section at the top. The small section at the top has Athens in it, and there's a tiny little strait that's 3.5 miles wide. That is where the port of Corinth was, and that is where the church that Paul had planted in Acts 18 was set. Paul had been there about 18 months, and he had left and gone to Ephesus, and whilst in Ephesus he got word of problems that were happening within the church. It's not the first letter that Paul sends to the Corinthians, because he makes note of it in the book, and there may well have been many others, but we do have 1 and 2 Corinthians in our Bible. The church of Corinth had many issues, and Paul addresses some of them in this letter. It was, as I say, it was a port. The only way you could get from one side of that strait to the other, from the Saronic Sea to the Ionian Sea, was through the port of Corinth. So there's all this culture, Greek culture, Jewish culture, and basically culture of every other nation all meeting together. And a lot of the issues that Paul addresses in his letter are to do with cultural issues and misunderstandings in the Bible. It's a great resource textbook to go and look and study for how do we deal with the issues that we face today, because the Bible doesn't highlight every single issue that you're going to face in your life right now, but it does give examples of how we should treat the issues, of how they treated their issues at that time, and the principles that we can apply. The issues that were faced in 1 Corinthians was to do with leadership, and in today's language we'd call it celebrity pastors, to do with sexual immorality, to do with food and what's right and what isn't, to do with church services and spiritual gifts and communion, and finally to do with the resurrection. And Paul's overriding message in all of this is that we need to treat each other with love. We need to make Jesus number one. Jesus is king. In the issue of celebrity pastors dealt with in chapters 1 through 4, he says to them, look, some of you are saying I follow Paul, some of you are saying I follow Apollos, others of you are saying I follow Peter. Now, this was a problem of Greek culture at the time, was that you would have schools of thought. So you would have Archimedes, or you would have Aristotle, and people would say I follow them and I don't listen to them, and that had creeped into the church. And Paul was saying, you don't need to be like that. Ultimately, if your leaders are pointing you to Jesus, that is what matters. You know, we have that today. We have denominations. You know, I'm this denomination, I don't listen to that denomination, or I support this leader and I don't listen to that. The message from Paul is simple. If it points you to Jesus, if their leader's helping you to get to Jesus, then it's a good thing. Then he moves on to talk about sexual immorality, and Corinth had a reputation. It had a really bad reputation. In Greek theatres, they would depict a person from Corinth as being somebody who was a drunkard, someone who was a womanizer. And Paul was speaking to the Corinthian church and saying, you've allowed this culture to come into your church. What's worse, actually, the things you are doing in your church right now is worse than the things that are happening outside. There were examples of a man sleeping with his stepmother, people sleeping around. There was an issue with prostitutes. There was all sorts of problems that were going on to do with sexual immorality. And Paul just makes it clear that, you claim that you have freedom, you claim that you have grace, but you can't use that grace to do whatever you want. What you need to do is to use that freedom to show people a better way of living life. Show people a better way of what God can do in your lives, and honour God with your bodies. Then in chapters 8 and 9, it talks about food, and it talks about they were having this problem of food being sacrificed to gods and then served. So we might say grace at the dinner table. They were sacrificing the food and then offering it around, and there was one camp that said this was really wrong, and another camp that said, oh no, it's absolutely fine. And Paul said ultimately their gods are nothing, because they're gods, and the food is nothing. So if you want to eat it, eat it. However, he said, if by doing so you cause somebody else to have a problem because they're thinking, well, they're mixing Jesus and another God, then don't do it. What you do in your own home is fine, but if you're going to cause somebody to stumble, don't do it. And that's a great principle for us all to live our lives by. And then in 1 Corinthians 10 through 14, it addresses issues to do with the church service and what they were happening when they came together on the first day of the week. They were having a problem with the Lord's Supper and communion. Yet the rich were coming and bringing loads and loads of food, and the poor were being put out and not being allowed to eat because they weren't able to bring much. Paul said this is not what communion is about. This is not how you should behave. It should be equality. It should be about Jesus once again. And then in 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about spiritual gifts and talks about what was happening there, because they were having a great spiritual moment, and people were having gifts of prophecy, people were having gifts of tongues, and they were arguing about which one was greater. Remember, this is Greek culture and they love to argue, and Paul was saying that is not how it should happen. Everything in church should be done to serve other people. So when you're dealing with gifts of the Spirit, they should be done to serve other people. It's not about making you look big, and he talks about the importance of prophecy and how tongues should be handled. And then we get a very famous verse, 1 Corinthians 13. Often it's read at weddings, and it's all about love. It's a chapter all about love. Love is patient, love is kind. And as I said, it's read out at weddings. And actually, that's taken it a little bit out of context, because Paul was talking about it in relation to the church service, to the fact that your heart when you come to church on a Sunday should be, how can I serve people? How can I love people? How can I make sure that what I'm doing is helping them connect with God? And then it moves on, and in chapter 15 it talks about the resurrection. And there was this thing in Greek culture that if the physical body was sort of less than the spirit, but Paul was preaching that we would have a physical body when when Jesus was resurrected. He would have a physical body, we would have a physical body when we get into heaven. And the Greeks couldn't understand this, and Paul was just saying, look, don't worry about it. God has got it all sorted. We're going to have heavenly bodies. Everything's going to be wonderful, and you just don't need to worry about it. And so he was addressing all of these issues, but overriding all of these issues was this one simple word, and that is love. Love God. Everything needs to point to Jesus. Our actions, our attitude needs to point to Jesus. Our love for him needs to be shown. Our love for each other within the church needs to be shown. And our love for others needs to be shown as well. And so that is my key verse for today, 1 Corinthians 13:13. And it says, and these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. You know, the message of 1 Corinthians, what issues of theology or debate you're having, make sure it's always done with love. Make sure the outcome of our actions is always one where we're showing people the best example of Jesus, where we're showing people the best example of God's love, where we're showing people the best example of our love for each other within the church, and then our love for people in the world. The church at Corinth had lots of issues, but Paul said when you look to Jesus and when you love each other, all of these issues melt away and you grow in maturity in Christ. And that is 1 Corinthians.